Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR FM 89.
Hello again, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us for a special edition of Arkansas Week. We're coming to you not from our usual digs, but from the conference room adjoining the office of the Governor of Arkansas, and our guest is the Honorable Asa Hutchinson. Thanks very much, Governor, for making yourself available.
Thank you, Steve. Good to be with you.
You are down now literally to days remaining in your term. 8 years. Reflections?
Well, it's been the highest honor of my public life to be Governor of Arkansas. And the reflections are that we've accomplished a great deal. We've met challenges that were unanticipated, such as a pandemic. We solved problems, we handled crisis, and that to me is what leadership is about. And with that, 8 years is a good length of time. I have no issue with being able to move on to new challenges and opportunities, but it's been incredible blessing for Susan and me to have this honor that the people of Arkansas gave us.
In terms of your accomplishments, what would you point to as saying number 1, 2, 3?
You know, it's really hard to prioritize those, but obviously the computer science initiative, tax cuts that are historic in proportion are two of the top, because those are real game changers, transformative changes for the state of Arkansas. You think about over $1 billion in tax relief, but the rate, more particularly, going from 7% individual income tax rate down to 4.9%. That's a huge differential that allows us to compete with other states. That's very significant. And then, you know, changing the whole landscape of Arkansas to be a national leader in computer science education, starting off 8 years ago with a simple pledge to say we're going to put computer science in every high school in Arkansas, and today we've accomplished that and more, going from 1,100 students taking computer science to over 23,000 this year, and nationally recognized for where we are in that. Is certainly, you know, a life changer for the young people, but also even our business development. We have technology companies that come here, startup companies, because of the talent that we're producing. So pretty excited about both of those policy changes that will make a difference in the lives of Arkansans.
Skeptics, or your critics, would offer 2 points regarding the tax cuts. One is that they unfairly favored the more affluent Arkansas taxpayers, and the other was that you chose tax cuts. In terms of policy, you chose tax cuts over strategic investments, say K-12, pre-K, higher ed. Your thoughts?
Well, let's take those one at a time. And you know, first, in terms of the style of the tax cuts, my first pledge was a $100 million middle income tax cut, which we did. The second time we came into session, we did a $50 million lower income tax cut. And so then we lowered the rate finally that covered some of the top earners. And then each time, though, we gave some benefit to the lower income as well. And so I think it's balanced, it was necessary, and it benefited every Arkansan. You know, on the second point, that somehow we shirked our responsibility for services, particularly education. You know, in our last General Assembly, I believe it was, we had the highest increase in education funding that we've had in 10 years. My budget that goes into place this year that I've recommended to the General Assembly has another incredibly large increase that would actually allow enough money to raise teacher salaries again. And so we've raised teacher salary once each year by $1,000 up to $4,000 on the minimum salary. And now we want to raise it more. So we've really invested in education. You look at the other services, you can't point to any that have been shirked. We have shrunk the size of state government in terms of state employees, but our services have improved, from education to drug treatment courts to foster care, So we've met those challenges and invested real dollars there.
When you took office, the Medicaid expansion was still a very, very, very hot topic. You got it through. And I note that you didn't mention it in terms of accomplishments. So are we to take from that in your view anyway, the Medicaid expansion is now a fixed part of Arkansas political life or policy life?
I do think that.
It's welded into the fabric.
The Medicaid expansion was extraordinarily difficult to continue. It took some creative engineering with the votes in the House and Senate to get it through, but we got it done. And it was really important that, once you expand the health care coverage, you don't want to be able to shrink it, particularly when we have a rural state like Arkansas and it benefits so many. So it is a part of the fabric of our healthcare system, but this last time we got a waiver from the Biden administration to expand services even more through our rural hospitals, called the Life 360 initiative, and it was legislatively driven, but that's part of the Medicaid expansion, but it's going to put real dollars in helping our rural hospitals survive and provide coverage for maternal health care, as well as mental and drug addiction counseling. So those are the kind of changes that can be made with states having flexibility. We've done that, and I think you'll continue to see those really good changes in Arkansas.
Really, from its first days, the expansion in Arkansas was built on waivers, was it not, in a sense?
Well, it was.
The private option, anyway, during your predecessor's administration.
Absolutely. A waiver is really a pilot project to see how it works. Well, we've been in that, we've had that waiver for our private option with the using Medicaid dollars to buy commercial insurance. And we've had that now for 12 years, I guess it is, since the beginning. So it's really a permanent part of it. But then we also have another pilot program for the Life 360 homes supporting our rural hospitals. And so that to me is innovation in healthcare. And that's the whole idea of the federal government giving us some flexibility to the states. We try new things. We've done that in Arkansas, and it's really something I believe will be beneficial to the nation as they study the results here in Arkansas.
In terms of the administration's track record with the General Assembly and in its interface with the private sector anyway, things were going pretty well for you. Along came COVID and changed not only, at least temporarily, the economy, but it changed the political equation as well, political situation as well. But those were among your most difficult days, I have to imagine.
Well, they were. They were difficult for everybody in leadership, whether it was healthcare and even Arkansas families. So absolutely, the pandemic was tough. It was very tough, and it was somewhat of a strain with the relationship with the legislature, but we were able to pull it back together and to make sure that we continued to work for the good of Arkansans, and subsequently we lowered taxes again. We invested in education. So that was just part of the strain of the pandemic, but we've had a lot of success through that and beyond that.
You went too far, according to some, in terms of restrictions on commerce, on education. The administration went too far. In retrospect, did you? That was the criticism anyway from some quarters of the General Assembly. In retrospect, did you go too far? Would you change anything?
Well, history will determine that, but when it comes to education, I'm very proud of the fact that Arkansas ranks number 2 in the nation in terms of days of in-classroom instruction during the pandemic. That means that we had more days of in-classroom instruction than Florida and Texas. We didn't, make a big deal about it, but we knew we had to keep our schools open. So I'm very proud of that. We didn't buckle to the pressure. We kept our businesses open. You'll remember that, Steve, where I was having to go on every national show and explain why we're not sheltering in place. Even President Trump was pushing governors to close and 30-day pause. And so I think that we really worked hard under my leadership to keep things open in Arkansas, and I think that's one of the reasons we recovered quickly economically. And so I think in hindsight, we did a lot of things well here. You know, whenever, it was very, very important for our churches that we never pushed any restrictions on our churches because of the separation of church and state, and the government's not telling the churches that they, can't gather for worship. That was an important principle that I followed during the pandemic, and some of those decisions I made are not well known, but they were important nonetheless.
Well, in fact, those schools were closed. Public schools and private followed suit for a fairly substantial time.
In March of 2020, whenever the pandemic hit, our schools went virtual for that spring semester. They went virtual, so they were still open, but they were virtual. But after that, I determined we've got to go back for in classroom. It can't be virtual, it's got to be in classroom for the beginning of that fall of 2020 school. And if you'll remember, that's when the cases started going up. I had teachers protesting from some school districts in front of the mansion, saying you're going to put us in the grave. Tremendous pressure to close the schools, to go virtual in the fall of 2020. And I said no, and Secretary Key backed it up. We know how important it is to have the in-classroom instruction. We had to pivot from time to time, but we did that. And that was unique, what we did in Arkansas compared to what a lot of other states did nationally.
COVID did what? Well, put it this way, all of your predecessors that I've covered have, at one time or another, expressed some frustration at the institutional limits on executive authority, the power of the governor in Arkansas. COVID prompted the General Assembly to assume even more authority than it had previously had. Have you found that have you been frustrated in how the hoops that you may have to jump through? A governor's unable to snap his fingers and make some things done. Is it too far out of balance?
By and large, no. I think there's a good check and balance between the executive branch and the legislative branch. When it comes to managing emergencies, I believe the governor has sufficient flexibility. It was really just from an infectious disease standpoint that the legislature drafted new language to share more of the responsibility. And I worked with them on that, and we agreed to it, and I signed it into law. And I think it's fine. It just simply means I declare an emergency, and they have to come in within 30 days and to reaffirm it or not. And that's a tough, and it's worked. We've done that, we've put it into use, and it's worked well. Where I think it's important to understand that the governor of Arkansas has one of the weakest vetoes of any governor in the country.
Simple majority.
Simple majority, and that's where it gets out of balance. And so, I've vetoed a number of pieces of legislation. Only one has been overridden. I have to obviously be very careful about what I veto because it's not going to accomplish anything and it's going to create a lot of ill feelings. I've tried to be reserved in it, but the governor, whenever you take the executive branch and say this law is not a good law, then it ought to be some kind of a supermajority to override that. That's the whole concept of a veto, and so that's something that I hope that can be looked at down the road and improve, correct that to what I see as an imbalance.
You had to spend a good deal of time persuading the General Assembly to abandon some of its on social legislation, cultural issues, hot button cultural issues that you were usually prevailed in quashing. How much time, how big of a distraction was that to the administration? I mean, you were worried about education, economic development, and other issues.
Well, that's just part of the process. That's just part of having a General Assembly that's hard at work. And it's really reflecting the fact that many people in Arkansas, me included, we're concerned about our culture. Well, what's the direction is it going, and how do you address it? What's being taught in our schools? But the difference is that I don't believe the solution is always passing a law. It is about parental involvement in our schools. It's about who's on the school board. It's about transparency. And it's also, if you look at the cultural issues that we face, it's about the strength of our communities, our churches, and our families. And that's where we impact our culture, versus simply passing a law, because that has a lot of repercussions and it's not very conservative. Now, so I pick and choose. I signed the law that said biological males cannot compete in women's sports. I believe that. I think it's something that's important. I believe in girls who participate. They ought to be able to compete with each other. So I signed that into law. But then others I pushed back against, and so there's a balance there, and that's what the legislative process is.
Have we spent too much time in Arkansas on these cultural hot buttons, bathroom bills, et cetera?
Well, I don't know if you can say too much time, but the bathroom bills is a good example. At the time those were presented, I said these are the most sensitive issues in the world, and they can be handled by our local school districts. We don't need to pass a law that is a statewide prescription for a challenge that some school districts face and others don't. And to me, whenever a teacher or a principal and parents get together and they work through these issues, that's the right way to handle it. And so, sure, I don't think that was a healthy debate necessarily, but that is what we do in a democracy.
There is now in the federal courts a challenge to the statutes that the General Assembly enacted regarding medical care for trans youth. Should that law be sustained? What is your hope for the outcome of that litigation?
Well, I vetoed that legislation,
right.
And so I do believe there's some constitutional issues there. I think the Judge Moody has indicated he has some concerns there. That's why it was enjoined. We'll see the ultimate outcome, but it's really important when you look at that legislation dealing with our trans youth or those that are suffering from gender dysphoria. I would have signed that law immediately if it would have simply prohibited reassignment surgeries for minors. That goes too far, shouldn't happen, it's irreversible. It's not best medical practices. It doesn't happen in Arkansas, but I would have signed that. But whenever you get into, medication and other issues, I think the power of the state can be reserved and leave that to a doctor and a parent. Conservatives are always talking about parents need to make decisions. Well, let's not take that power away from parents and the physicians on a very difficult issue that our children are facing.
If you were granted another term as governor, would you advocate for, would you sign an exemption, an abortion exemption for rape and incest victims? Should that be permitted?
I would sign a law that recognized the exemptions for rape and incest. That's been my historic position. I think we can lose the debate easily on pro-life values whenever we don't allow those two exceptions. But that's my position. I would sign that.
You are entitled to offer your successor some advice. What would it be?
I wouldn't want to be presumptive to offer her advice. Listen, she's
well, we're asking. I mean, you're not presuming.
She's going to, I would say, work closely with the legislature, but she doesn't need advice. She's got, she ran a great campaign. She's, got an agenda for this next legislative session. It concentrates on education, reading initiatives, so I applaud that. Wish her well in every way, and I think she will be successful.
Moving on, you're moving on. Again, you're just down to days now. You have expressed an interest in the presidency, so everyone assumes that you're running until you declare that you are not running. So What is the path forward that you see? You're rather to the left, most people believe, of contemporary Republican politics, or are you, sir?
You know, my record is very conservative in Arkansas, and people on the national scene understand that I have a conservative record, and it's been consistent for 40 years in Arkansas politics. But I think what distinguishes me, I listen, I try to work across the aisle, I try to resolve problems, and to me that means you're a common sense conservative. I'm not going to get elected in a Republican primary if people perceive me other than a conservative, and I think my record justifies that. But we do need to have pragmatism, optimism about our country. We don't need to concentrate on division. We need to concentrate on addition. And I'm proud of the record that we have of diversity in Arkansas. I think I have actually the most diverse cabinet in the history of any governor in Arkansas. Very proud of that record. Women, minorities, and I think that reflects who I am as a person, and that we try to bring people together. You know, in terms of 2024, that's one of the biggest leaps that anybody can make. I have been pleased with response, but it's not only practical politics and impacts on family, but it also involves a lot of money that you have to raise, and so we got to make some tough decisions that'll come up in January or beyond, but we're looking at it, and we'll see where it leads.
You have said, sir, that it's time for your party to move past Trumpism. Mr. Trump patently does not agree with that. He's announced his candidate. The midterm elections, what does that suggest to you?
Well, the midterm
about the mood of your party, particularly on the primary landscape and the country as a whole?
Oh, I think it was a reminder. It was telling the Republican voters that we can't win if we nominate candidates in the primary that can't win in November. We have to nominate candidates that can attract independents and suburban voters. That's how you win in the general election, and that's where we want to win. Now, if you look back at the midterm elections, it was not a rejection of Republican principles and ideas, because candidates who ran on our principles and our ideas won, but if they were endorsed by Trump and they went too far that direction, they lost. And if they were debating and hanging out for denying the last election results, then they didn't prevail. And so there's a lesson to me is for the party, let's move forward, let's solve problems. Let's stick with our Republican principles, and we win when we do that.
Governor, thank you very much for your time, and to our audience, this constitutes our on-air version of our exit interview, as it were, with Mr. Hutchinson. But if you would like to go and join us on the web, on our web version, we have a couple of more minutes, I think, that the governor has granted us. So go to the web, and thanks for joining us.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR FM 89.